Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take complex intellectual structures, dive into the primary source material, and transform them into clear, accessible knowledge tailored specifically for you.
Today, we are tackling a structure so massive, so logically rigorous, that it really stands as one of the great philosophical achievements of the Western world.
The big one.
It is. We are embarking on a detailed and, I think, very deep exploration of excerpts from Baruch de Spinoza's Ethics, a work famously, and this is crucial, demonstrated in geometric order.
Our mission is ambitious then, because Spinoza used definitions, axioms, and just this relentless logical proof to map out, well, everything. The nature of God, the universe, human morality.
Right. He didn't write a philosophical essay. He wrote a metaphysical geometry textbook. It's built like Euclid.
So we need to unpack his foundational concepts, substance, God, necessity, and the whole mechanism of human emotion, and trace exactly how his quasi-mathematical proofs lead to these stunningly radical conclusions about determinism and freedom.
And it requires patience. It really does, because every single step is built on the previous one. If you accept his first three definitions, for example, you are logically compelled to accept his definition of God.
You're already on the train.
You're on the train, and eventually his entire view of human nature follows. This isn't about, mere theoretical speculation. It's a serious attempt to create a perfect, rigorous map of existence, starting from first causes and just tracing the inescapable consequences.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the bedrock, the specialized vocabulary Spinoza establishes before he proves a single thing.
Absolutely. The definitions are everything.
Spinoza knew that if his system was going to have the rigor of, say, Euclid's geometry, his starting terms had to be absolutely unambiguous. We need to get these right, or the whole structure just, well, it collapses.
It does.
So what is the absolute starting point?
The initial bedrock, the concept from which all independent existence flows, is what Spinoza calls the cause of itself.
Cause of itself, okay.
This is defined as that whose essence contains existence. Think of it like this. If you try to conceive of it, you must conceive of it as existing. Its very nature makes non-existence a logical impossibility.
Right, so it's intrinsically self-validating. It doesn't need external validation or creation.
Yeah.
It just is, by definition.
Exactly. And that self-sufficiency leads us directly to the star of the show, substance. In Polish, istota.
Substance, this is the big one.
This is the big one. Spinoza defines substance as that which exists in itself and is conceived through itself.
Okay, let's break that down. Exists in itself.
It's ontologically independent and needs nothing else to exist. But critically, the second part, it is conceived through itself.
Right.
This means it's also epistemologically independent. The concept of substance requires no other concept for its formation.
That seems like a huge leap right at the start. I mean, it immediately sets up substance as this unique and singular thing, essentially eliminating the need for an external creator.
It does.
If it's conceived through itself, it's the ultimate foundation. There's nothing before it.
It is the unconditioned reality. Now, everything else that we experience, everything that isn't substance, must therefore be conditioned. That leads us to modes or affections. The Polish word is objawy.
Oh.
A mode is defined as that which exists in something else and is conceived through that something else. Modes are, simply put, the ways in which substance is affected or modified.
Okay, so if substance is the ocean, then modes are the individual waves, the ripples, the currents.
Perfect analogy.
They get their existence and their nature entirely from the ocean. They're completely dependent.
Precisely. And in between the substance and the modes, we have this crucial connection point, the attribute, presymia.
An attribute.
An attribute is defined as what the intellect perceives in substance as constituting its essence.
Ah, so it's a bridge. It's the way substance presents its infinite essence to, a finite intellect like ours.
Exactly. The distinction is subtle, but it's profound. The attribute isn't the essence itself, but it's how the essence is understood or perceived.
Does that imply there could be infinite attributes? But our perception is limited. We can only see a couple of them.
It absolutely does. And that brings us right to the definition of God. Boastur.
Okay.
Spinoza defines God as the being that is absolutely infinite, consisting of an infinite quantity of attributes, where each one expresses an eternal and infinite essence.
Let's stop on absolutely infinite. Why does he emphasize that particular phrasing? It feels very specific.
It is. He clarifies that distinction because infinite is often used, a bit loosely. If something is infinite in its kind, say infinitely large space, you can still deny that entity other attributes, like the attribute of thought.
I see. So a line can be infinitely long, but it has no width. It's only infinite in one respect.
Exactly. But the absolutely infinite being God is defined such that nothing that expresses essence, that contains reality, can be denied of it. God must possess all reality, all power, and all essential attributes infinitely.
So it's a maximum definition. God is the maximum reality conceivable.
It is, and this definition really sets the stage for God being the only substance possible, which we'll get to.
Wow. Okay. So how does this metaphysical foundation, how does it lead to his definitions of human experience, especially a concept like freedom?
Well, it forces a complete revision of our common language. Spinoza defines free versus necessary. A thing is called freer if it exists only from the necessity of its own nature and determines itself to act.
Wait, okay. So something is free if it acts from its own necessity.
Yes, and it is necessary or compelled if its existence and action are determined by something else.
That's completely counterintuitive to how most people understand freedom. Freedom for us is about making an arbitrary choice, choosing A over B for no necessary reason.
Spinoza would say that's not freedom, that's just ignorance of the causes. For him, freedom is self-determination. It's self-necessity. If you are determined by anything external, be it another person, the environment, or even your own unexamined passive desires, you are compelled. You are not free.
So this is the seed of his entire ethical project. Achieving freedom means achieving absolute self-determination.
That's the goal.
And finally, a word about time. What is eternity Weichsnoschitsch in this system?
Eternity is not duration. It's not time without end. It's existence itself, but conceived as an eternal truth.
Like a mathematical truth.
Precisely. Think of the geometric truth that the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. That truth doesn't last for all time. It exists timelessly, necessarily. It follows from the definition. That is the kind of existence substance has.
Okay. So we have the players, the self-caused, self-conceived, absolutely infinite substance, which he calls God. And then we have the dependent, conceived through another modes. Now, what are the rules of the game? The axioms.
The axioms are the foundational rules of causality and order. The first axiom establishes the universe's completeness. Everything that is either in itself, substance, or in something else mode.
That's it. A simple statement that divides all of reality into two and only two exhaustive categories.
There is no outside. There is no third option for existence. Then there's another critical rule, the epistemic link. Knowledge of the effect depends on and involves knowledge of the cause.
So that maps the causal order of the universe onto the logical order of our minds. To truly understand a mode, the effect, you have to understand the substance, the cause, where it came from.
It's a philosophical mandate, really. If you want knowledge, you must pursue the ultimate cause. And that pursuit is governed by the rule of distinction. Things having nothing in common cannot be mutually understood through each other.
So if two things share no essence, you can't use one to explain the other.
Correct. And this rule is the geometric mechanism Spinoza uses next to enforce the singularity of existence.
This sets the stage for one of the most radical conclusions in all philosophy, the idea that there is only one substance.
Here we go.
We spent a lot of time defining the terms, and now Spinoza starts putting them to work, leveraging those axioms to prove something truly revolutionary. He moves immediately to establish the uniqueness of substance.
He does, and that argument is devastatingly elegant. He uses that rule of distinction we just mentioned and the definition of substance, that it's conceived through itself, to prove that two or more substances cannot exist with the same attribute or nature.
Okay, why? If I have two distinct entities, say two different gold rings, they share the attribute of being gold. Why can't there be two substances sharing the attribute of, say, thought?
Because Spinoza's substance is not like a gold ring. It's not a collection of parts. It's a foundational, independent reality. If you had two substances, let's call them A and B, and they shared the same attribute, they would have to be distinguishable in some way.
Right. Otherwise, it'd be the same thing.
So how could you distinguish them? Not by their attributes, because we're assuming those are identical. You could only distinguish them by their modes, their specific manifestations.
Okay, like one mind thinking about philosophy, another mind thinking about lunch.
Exactly. But when you abstract away the modes and look only at the underlying substance, which, by definition, must be conceived through itself without reference to anything else, they become conceptually identical. They can't be distinguished, and therefore they cannot be two distinct substances.
That is a neat if a very demanding piece of logic.
Yes.
It forces the reality that for any given attribute, say, extension, this physical world, There can only be one substance that possesses it.
And since substance can't be produced by anything else, I mean, it can't be a mode of something else, and it can't be created by another substance because they'd either have nothing in common or they'd be identical. It must be self-caused.
Which means existence belongs to its very nature.
Right. Doubting the existence of substance becomes like doubting the truth of the concept itself. It's a contradiction.
This brings us to the next geometric necessity in a system. Every substance is necessarily infinite.
Yes. If substance were finite, it would have to be limited by another thing of the same nature. That's how Spinoza defines finite, limited by another of the same kind.
Like one person is limited by another person.
But as we just established, two substances of the same nature cannot exist. Therefore, substance cannot be limited by anything. And that makes it necessarily infinite. This infinity isn't just a lack of boundaries, it's an absolute affirmation of existence and power.
So we have an entity that is unique in its kind, self-caused, and infinitely powerful in its affirmation of existence. It must be God. But I notice in the text, Spinoza feels the need to offer multiple proofs for God's necessary existence. Why not just one?
Well, the primary argument is ontological, built right into the definitions. God's essence contains existence, so non-existence is a contradiction. Simple enough. But the second proof, the a posteriori proof, is often more revealing about Spinoza's way of thinking. It links existence to power.
The idea that non-existence is a form of weakness, and the possibility of existence is power.
Yes. Spinoza argues that the possibility of non-existence is an impotence, a lack of power. If the absolutely infinite being God did not necessarily exist, and yet we finite beings do exist, that would imply that the finite, which has limited power, is more powerful than the absolutely infinite being.
Which is an absurdity.
A complete absurdity.
Yeah.
Since we can observe existence all around us, the being of absolute power must also exist. He summarizes it perfectly. The more reality a thing possesses, the more power it has to exist. Since God possesses absolute reality, he has the absolute power to exist and therefore exists necessarily.
This is a completely impersonal God, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's defined entirely by logical necessity and maximal power, not by benevolence or consciousness or will.
Precisely. And this necessary infinite substance must also be indivisible. If the substance were divisible, the resulting parts would either retain the nature of infinite substance,
Which we just proved is impossible. No two substances of the same nature.
right, or they would lose the nature of substance, which would mean substance could cease to exist, which contradicts its necessary existence.
This has radical implications for the material world, doesn't it? I mean, if one of God's attributes is extension, physical existence, then Spinoza's arguing that material substance itself is also indivisible. That seems to defy our everyday experience of, breaking a stick in half.
It does, and Spinoza addresses this head-on. He calls division a conceptual tool of the imagination based on viewing things superficially.
So it's an illusion.
For him, yes. When viewed through the pure intellect, the attribute of extension is infinite, unique, and indivisible, just like the attribute of thought. The perceived divisibility is merely the mode affecting our finite senses, not the underlying substance itself.
Okay, after all this geometric construction, this careful building of proofs, we reach the central world-defining conclusion. Besides God, no substance can be given or conceived.
This is absolute monism. Since God has an infinite number of attributes and no two substances can share an attribute, if a second substance were to exist, it would have to possess an attribute that God does not.
But God, being absolutely infinite, possesses all attributes.
So it's a logical impossibility. God is the sole reality.
So if God is the sole substance, and everything we see, the entire universe, us, our thoughts, our bodies, if all these things are conceived of and exist, then everything must be God.
That's the leap to panentheism. Whatever is in God, and nothing without God can either be or be conceived. Everything we observe, whether it's a physical object, which is a mode of the attribute of extension, or an idea, a mode of the attribute of thought, or just manifestations or affections of God's one infinite substance.
I think we need to clarify that term for our listener because people often confuse Spinoza's view with simple pantheism. Pantheism means God is all. Panentheism means all is in God. What's the subtle difference that Spinoza maintains?
It's crucial. For Spinoza, God, the substance, is the whole, the unconditioned, self-determining reality. The individual modes us, the trees, the stars, are merely parts or expressions of God, but they do not exhaust God's infinite nature.
So God is infinitely more than the sum of all the visible parts.
Infinitely more. If God were merely the total collection of modes, which is simple pantheism, then God would be contingent upon those modes and their finite relationships, which contradicts the definition of substance. God transcends the modes by containing infinite attributes we can't even conceive of, while simultaneously being immanent in every mode we can.
He is the ultimate, immanent cause of all things.
That's the phrase.
And this changes the focus entirely.
Hmm.
We move from proving that God exists to proving how God acts. And it seems like the consequences are enormous.
They are. The whole universe is about to get reframed.
If God is the sole necessary substance, then God is not a conscious actor making choices, but a necessary causal force, the machinery of the universe itself. What are the inevitable consequences of realizing that?
Well, the first consequence is a universal, inescapable determinism. Spinoza asserts that from the necessity of God's nature must follow infinitely many things, in infinitely many ways.
That's like a mathematical equation.
Exactly. Just as from the definition of a triangle, its properties, the sum of its angles being 180 degrees, follow necessarily, so too does the entire complex reality of the universe follow from the infinite definition of God.
It's a purely deductive universe.
Yeah.
And that means God acts not by choice, but by law.
Absolutely. God acts exclusively according to the laws of his own nature and is compelled by nothing external. He is a free cause only in that special Spinoza sense that he is determined only by himself.
Right, the definition of freedom we talked about earlier.
Yes. And crucially, Spinoza uses this point to dismantle the traditional religious concept of choice. To say God could have chosen to create the universe differently is, in Spinoza's view, arguing absurdly. It's like saying God could cause the properties of a triangle not to follow from its nature. It's a contradiction in terms.
This sets the stage for one of Spinoza's most famous intellectual battles, the total rejection of teleology, or final causes.
He finds the belief in purpose that God created the universe for some end, for humanity's benefit or his own glory, to be one of the greatest philosophical errors. And he thinks it stems entirely from human pride and ignorance.
Why is it an error in his system?
Because if God acted for a purpose, it would imply that God desired something he lacked. But God, being absolutely perfect and infinite, cannot lack anything. Therefore, God cannot act towards an end external to himself. All the ends and purposes we think we see in nature are just human interpretations based on finding things useful to ourselves.
This explains why Spinoza rejects the idea that God possesses a human-like intellect and will. If God willed the universe into existence, that suggests a gap between intention and reality, which an infinite being can't have.
Precisely. If intellect and will belong to God's eternal essence, Spinoza insists they must differ from ours, in essence and existence. Our intellect is just a mode and effect. God's intellect is the absolute cause of all essences and existence. Thinking that God has human-like free will, or human judgment, or human emotions is, for Spinoza, a massive category error. It's a delusion born from ignorance.
So if God, the one substance, acts by eternal necessity, then everything we see must also be necessary. This leads to the formal statement of determinism. In the nature of things, we have nothing contingent. On the contrary, everything is determined by the necessity of God's nature to exist and to act.
Contingency, the idea that something could have been otherwise, is banished from the universe. It's an illusion, an artifact created by our lack of complete information. If we knew the infinite chain of causes dictated by God's nature, nothing would ever appear accidental or contingent.
It's just one single, eternal, and determined process.
It is. And this leads to the famous distinction between naturamatrons and naturata.
Creative nature versus created nature.
Right. Naturans, or creative nature, is God viewed as the active cause. It's the substance and its attributes, seen as this self-determining power. Naturata, or created nature, is everything that follows from that necessity. It's the infinite series of modes, all the created things that exist in God.
So it's the same universe, just viewed from two different perspectives. The active cause and the necessary effect.
You've got it. It's one ongoing process.
Now, if the universe is total necessity, then we, as finite modes, have no special exemption. This brings us back to the most controversial part of Spinoza's philosophy, the denial of human free will.
This is the hard pill to swallow for most people. Spinoza asserts that the will, wola, cannot be called a free cause, but only a necessary one. Since the will is a mode of thinking, every specific volition, every thought or choice you make is determined to exist and act by an infinite chain of prior causes that stretch back into eternity.
But the common person, myself included, believes they can choose to raise their hand or not, based on some uncaused mental act. It feels like I'm in control. How does Spinoza address that internal feeling of autonomy?
He simplifies the problem by collapsing the distinct faculties of will and intellect. For Spinoza, they are the same thing. They aren't some distinct, unlimited power housed in the mind. The will is merely the collection of individual affirmations and negations, the specific ideas and volitions that arise.
So will and intellect are just general concepts we use to categorize individual acts, like human is a category for Peter and Paul.
That's his analogy exactly. And from that, he concludes that what we call free will is simply the consciousness of an appetite whose causes we ignore.
That's the source of the illusion.
It is. His famous quote here is powerful.
Hmm.
People believe they are free only because they are conscious of their appetites and volitions, but are ignorant of the causes that determine them. The baby believes it freely desires milk. The drink believes he speaks by free decision. The enraged man believes he is choosing to curse.
So to think one speaks or is silent by free decision is, in his words, to dream with open eyes.
Yes. He views the mind and body as simultaneous determinations. The mind's decision arises at the exact same instant as the body's physical determination to act. We are conscious of the result, the urge to speak, but we're utterly blind to the long chain of material and cognitive causes that made that urge necessary. There is no arbitrary, uncaused choice anywhere in the system.
Okay, so if we are simply necessary no's in God's infinite causal chain, what's the point of ethics? If everything is determined, why bother discussing how one should live? This is where part 3 comes in, I assume, applying this geometry to the human condition.
That's the whole point of the book. The first 2 parts are the physics, the metaphysics. The rest is the ethics that follows necessarily from it.
Spinoza now transitions from the grand scale of metaphysics to the inner workings of the human being, a finite mode of substance. His stated goal in part 3 is revolutionary for the time. He proposes to examine human passions, hate, anger, envy, just as if they were lines, planes, or bodies, arguing they follow necessary laws of nature.
He is stripping away all moral judgment. He wants to view human psychology through a lens of scientific geometric necessity. To do this, he first needs to find the foundational force that drives all modes, the universal striving. This is the concept of conatus. In Polish, dumusić.
Konatus, define that for us.
The conatus is defined as the striving of everything to persevere in its own being. It is, quite literally, the actual essence of the thing.
The essence.
Yes. It is the intrinsic power of self-preservation, stemming directly from the fact that its existence is derived from God's infinite power. It's the internal engine driving everything forward.
So every single entity, whether it's a stone or a person, is defined by its ceaseless struggle to maintain its own existence.
And that striving becomes our primary motive force. When this conatus relates to the mind and body together, Spinoza calls it appetite. When we become conscious of that appetite, when we recognize what we are striving for, it becomes desire.
So desire is nothing but the conscious essence of a person determined to action. It's the conatus of a rational mode.
You've got it.
This concept of desire as the foundation of our essence immediately allows Spinoza to execute a famous reversal of traditional value systems.
Yes, the overthrow of, Plato and Aristotle. For centuries, philosophy argued we strive for things because we judge them to be good. For example, we strive for health because we judge health to be a good state.
Makes sense.
Spinoza turns this completely on its head, he says. We do not strive for something because we judge it good. Rather, we call something good because we strive for it, will it, or desire it.
Wow. So value is a necessary consequence of our striving, not the cause of it. If my conatus dictates that I pursue intellectual knowledge, then intellectual knowledge is my good. It's subjective, but necessarily determined.
It connects value directly back to the power of the individual mode. The highest good is anything that aids our perseverance, our power, our conatus.
Based on this primary striving, desire Spinoza then defines the 3 primary effects, the emotional points of the triangle from which all other emotions are derived.
Right. Desire is the determined essence of man. The other 2 are states of transition relating to that essence. Joy, redefinition, is defined as a person's transition from a lesser to a greater perfection.
A transition.
And sorrow, smutek, is defined as a person's transition from a greater to a lesser perfection.
The emphasis on transition is key. Why not just say joy is a state of perfection?
Because if you were born in a state of absolute perfection, you wouldn't feel the emotion of joy. Joy is the dynamic, active feeling of the conatus succeeding, the body's power of action increasing.
I see. And sorrow is the feeling of the conatus being thwarted.
Exactly. The body's power of action is diminishing. These are necessary physical and mental affections that result from our interactions with external causes.
And when we connect these feelings of transition to the external causes that produce them, we generate our social emotions, starting with love and hate.
That's the next step. Love is joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Hate is sorrow accompanied by the idea of an external cause.
It's so mechanical. If something
Yeah.
increases my power of acting, I feel joy. If I associate that joy with the object that caused it, I love that object.
They are purely reactive mechanical states. And this mechanism then explains complex social interactions, including the unfortunate ones. Spinoza shows that even empathy is just a geometric consequence of love.
How so?
Well, if I love someone and I imagine that person experiences joy, I too experience joy. Their transition to greater perfection causes a sympathetic transition in me. This is the foundation of community and shared happiness.
But the exact same mechanism, operating under the same law of necessity, explains conflict, envy, and ambition. This is often the most insightful part of Spinoza's psychological observations.
It is. Look at Theorem 32 in Part 3. Spinoza writes, "If we imagine that someone enjoys the thing that only one person can possess, we will strive to bring it about that he does not possess it."
That is the necessary geometry of envy. It's not a moral failing. It's a required consequence of the conatus operating in a competitive, zero-sum environment.
Exactly. He notes that human nature is structured such that we pity those who fare poorly, sorrow in others, causes sorrow in us, which we try to alleviate, but we envy those who fare well if the good is exclusive.
That's a sharp observation.
He concludes that ambition, envy, and greed arise from the same necessary properties of human nature as mercy and pity. They are all necessary consequences of the mind associating sorrow or joy with external causes, particularly when scarcity is involved.
This means that good and evil are utterly relative concepts, tied entirely to our specific, necessary emotional state.
Spinoza drives this home in Part 4. Good and evil are relative to human emotion. The ambitious man sees glory as the highest good, the miser sees money. Every person judges according to their own determined desires. There is no universal, objective moral standard outside of what reason shows us is truly useful for self-preservation.
This sounds like a philosophical dead end for ethics. I mean, if everything is necessary and value is relative, how do we establish a moral framework that leads to a good life?
That is the central problem of the ethics. That's what the whole book is building towards. We must find a way to escape passive suffering and transition into a state of active power, and that escape must, paradoxically, come through reason, the understanding of necessity itself.
We have established a universe of total necessity where our emotions are passive transitions determined by external causes. If we are slaves to necessity, where is freedom? Spinoza's final two books argue that true freedom is only achieved by understanding this very necessity.
He first redefines virtue, Canota. For him, virtue is simply the power mock of man, defined by the striving to preserve one's being, the conatus.
So virtue is power.
The more one strives for self-preservation through active internal causes, acting according to one's own nature, the more virtue one possesses. The pursuit of one's own advantage, rationally understood, is the foundation of morality.
He reinforces this deterministic view of virtue, even through extreme examples like suicide.
Right. For Spinoza, suicide is impossible from the necessity of one's own nature. No one desires non-existence as an end in itself. It must result from external causes overwhelming the individual's conatus. The desire to preserve the self is the most fundamental, necessary, and virtuous drive.
The key to freedom, then, is transforming our necessary actions from being determined by passive emotions, where we are suffering external forces, to being determined by reason, or Russadek.
Yes, reason acts on us as an adequate internal cause. A passive emotion, like fear or hatred, is based on an inadequate, confused idea of its cause. We suffer under it. But an action determined by reason is active. We are the cause, and our essence dictates the outcome. The whole goal is to move from passive suffering to active understanding.
How does he prescribe this change? What is the practical step toward freedom?
The central therapeutic insight of Part V is revolutionary, he says. An emotion ceases to be a passion, a passive state, as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it.
Just understanding the emotion cures it. Is that what he's saying?
In a sense, yes. The suffering is in the confusion, the inadequate idea that links the emotion to a specific, arbitrary external cause. By understanding the emotion, by seeing its necessary causes within the grander scheme of things, we separate it from that confusing external cause and connect it with true ideas.
Specifically, with the idea of God's eternal, necessary order.
Right. Understanding the necessity of the cause transforms the passive feeling into an active experience of understanding. The mind's power over the emotions lies entirely in this act of cognition.
This means the path of reason directs us toward the good, Directly, not just, avoiding evil.
Exactly. Reason seeks survival and power through active joy, not by avoiding sorrow through passive fear. When guided by reason, we pursue the greatest good, which is the knowledge of God, because it is universally useful and common to all. It increases the perfection of everyone, allowing the maximum expression of the kanatas.
This mastery culminates in the highest state of self-satisfaction, what he calls zadawalani's Sive.
The highest self-satisfaction arises from understanding oneself and one's power of acting through reason. This self-knowledge is the internal reward of virtue. And this necessary process of understanding leads directly to the ultimate ethical goal, the intellectual love of God. Umiuani Rosamoa Bospa.
This is the peak of the system. Walk us through the final steps of this geometric argument for love.
Okay. So knowledge, especially the third and highest kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge, causes the greatest possible joy.
Right, because it's the highest increase in our perfection.
And since love is defined as joy, accompanied by the idea of an external cause, and the highest joy comes from understanding our own necessary existence and the necessary order of all things, we are necessarily led to associate this ultimate joy with the ultimate cause of all things, God.
Therefore, he who clearly understands himself and his emotions necessarily loves God.
It's an inevitable conclusion of the system.
And since this love arises from intuitive knowledge, which he argues is eternal, the love itself is eternal.
It is the part of the human mind that achieves eternity. It's impervious to the changes of the body or the vicissitudes of fortune because it's based on necessary, timeless truth.
But the most profound conclusion, the capstone of Spinoza's entire system, is the reciprocity he asserts in the final part of the Ethics. This part always gets me.
This is truly breathtaking. Spinoza states that the intellectual love of God of the human mind is God's own love, a part of the infinite love with which God loves himself, insofar as he is explained through the human mind.
Wait. Unpack that. God's love for humans and humans' intellectual love for God are the same thing.
They are the very same thing. When we achieve this state of rational, eternal understanding, our perfected mind becomes a sort of mirror, reflecting the eternal, necessary love that God, the infinite self-determining substance, has for his own infinite perfection.
So our highest state of love is not something we give to God. It's our active participation in God's eternal process of loving himself.
We become part of the naturans itself in that moment.
What an intensely deterministic yet deeply uplifting spiritual conclusion. It redefines freedom, not as breaking the chains of causality, but as fully consciously embracing them.
And that leads to true blessedness. Blessedness, buk or wonosh, is not a reward for virtue. It is virtue itself. It is the steady and eternal intellectual love of God.
So the wise person, operating under the guidance of reason, strives to repay hatred and contempt with love and nobility.
Not out of some moral obligation, but because reason dictates this is the most effective way to preserve his own power and perfection. He lives in a state of tranquil satisfaction, seldom troubled by agitation, because he understands that everything follows from the necessary laws of God's nature. This understanding is freedom.
The ultimate goal is that internal satisfaction of the spirit, the zadawalani ducha arising from this intuitive, rational knowledge.
The knowledge of necessity is the source of active joy. It transforms passive suffering, which arises from causes we don't understand, into active engagement rooted in clear, rational self-knowledge. You gain power by knowing the geometry of your own existence.
We began this deep dive with an unrelenting sequence of geometric definitions regarding substance and cause, and through an almost terrifyingly consistent logical path, we concluded with the intellectual love of God as the ultimate state of human freedom.
It's an incredible journey.
Spinoza leaves us with the message that everything, from the movement of the planets to the most fleeting human desire, is necessary.
The profound implication is that true freedom is found not in the illusion of arbitrary free will, which Spinoza utterly rejects, but in aligning ourselves with that necessity through reason. The path to blessedness is internal, converting the confusing, external-driven passive desires into clear actions rooted in our own necessary rational essence.
That structural clarity and the detailed philosophical depths, moving step by step from the definition of a cause to the definition of eternal love, is what makes ethics not just a philosophy book, but a complete map of reality.
The core takeaway is that the perfection of reason leads to zadawalani dusha, that deep satisfaction arising from the intuitive, necessary knowledge of God or nature.
So, a final thought for you. Spinoza states that true blessedness is not a reward, but an inherent quality of virtue. If achieving true freedom is contingent on understanding the necessity of all things, How might acknowledging the necessary causes behind a recent frustration or joy change your reaction to that event the next time it occurs? What power do you gain by understanding that in the geometric universe nothing could ever have been otherwise?